Sandy, remember that hurricane that struck New York and New Jersey and devastated many of our centers? 5 years after the date Sandy struck, I was at a ribbon-cutting center in Hoboken, New Jersey, 5 years later. So it tells me that recovery takes a long time. And I think coupled with the digging out, I think the other issues that were coupled with that were struggling with under-enrollment and staff vacancies. It's kind of all connected. And then trying to maintain pre-K staff when you're competing with your public schools who are paying much more. And the other thing that has been, you have been loud on this, Region 1 has been very loud on this for a very long time, and I think it's even been exacerbated since COVID. How do we support children with extremely challenging needs? And are we all equipped to do it? And I'm going to talk more about that a little later. But you have been champions pushing that issue, that we need to recognize that we have children that have needs, that we need to somehow up our game, do things differently, have more funds, have more therapeutic interventions available to us. Because right now, it rests all with you. You're doing it all by yourself. The other thing that I think, how many of you have worried every day about, are we going to have a health and safety incident? And what repercussions is that going to have? And if you had one, how scared are you that you're going to have another one? And then you're going to be in DRS. So I think that there are things, and I'm talking about, this is on my watch too, there are things that even if we weren't in this current environment, we need to improve upon. And I'm going to mention a little bit more about DRS, or maybe I'll mention it right now. The designation renewal system. And when Congress last reauthorized in 2007, Kat, they basically said, HHS, you need to develop a system that ensures us that we have the best programs providing services in local communities. Because prior to that mandate, we had grants in perpetuity. How many of you had grants for 40 years? And you had that, what did they call the project period? Unending or something? You had it forever. And then all of a sudden, DRS hit, and you were getting grants every 5 years. And then you were going to be evaluated. The intent I get, but how we operationalized it was not good. And so I'm pointing that out because I think there are areas in Head Start, in early Head Start, that we need improvement. But most of them are at the federal level and how we operationalize some of the things we do. And often we don't realize, and I think that this is true, how many laws and rules come out, and it sounds good, but the implementation is what can be crippling to the local community. So I think, I would urge, and I have been urging, the federal government to really think about what changes we need. Even during these difficult times, we still need to think about what program improvements we can make at the federal level. And that's not Region 1, that's kind of central office, and that's HHS. They need to own it and figure out how to make our lives less stressful. You have enough stress already. And I say all this because you're coming to a time, and the reason I wanted to sort of take stock of where you've been, you come to this period, this chapter in Head Start's life cycle, there's a lot of wear and tear, and people are already exhausted. So how do we garner the energy and the fight? Because in 60 years, we've never backed down from a challenge. And we cannot and will not today. I want to touch upon a few key areas I hope are worthy of your consideration as we move forward. And one thing I want to stress, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about this here over the past couple of days, is that as a national program, we all want the same outcomes and successes for our children and families. And having a united national platform where all of our beliefs and principles that we believe are worth fighting for is really important. having a national platform. But as important, we want to celebrate, even though we want the same outcomes, we want to celebrate and embrace the uniqueness of each program and the importance of that federal to local funding. That's why it's so important, because the money goes in the hands of your organizations and you get to decide what's best for your program. We don't want to lose that autonomy. And as I was listening to the parents, how interesting, I kind of thought maybe home visiting was not such a big deal anymore. And to hear the impact. But you don't hear that in a lot of places around the country. You hear it kind of more in the West Coast, Northwest, and the Northeast. So we are different. And those uniquenesses are also as important because you have your own platform within your community of why you are so vital and important and need to continue. Today we hear so much about saving our democracy. And as I alluded to earlier, the structure of Head Start, federal to local, the governance structure, including policy council and parent committees, is just about the best example of democracy that I could imagine. And I told you when I came into Head Start, I really didn't have a lot of Head Start experience. I had passion, and I was a good advocate, but when it came time, and I'm ashamed to tell this story, but when it came time to pass our first budget, it was a couple $1 million at the time. It seemed huge to me at the time. And I thought to myself, I have to present in front of the policy council and get their approval? It seemed to me an unusual exercise. And I thought about, in my own kind of elitist way, well, we have parents on the policy council that are really young. Or I know we have parents that live paycheck to paycheck and can't even think about having a bank account or a savings account. So how are those parents going to figure out what's the best way to spend those $2 or $3 million? It was, you got me, hook, line, and sinker. Because what I've learned is when you give people information, they become informed and they can make reasonable and wonderful decisions for the program. And that was such a lesson. But the whole nature of the Policy Council is a hidden jewel. I mean, there's still some people that don't know what Head Start is. And there are certainly most of the people, unless you've been in Head Start, can't appreciate that governance structure. And you can see the leadership that parents gravitate towards it, and then go on to become the leaders that they always had the capacities to be. They just didn't know it until they were given an opportunity. So I just want to say, we have to think about, and again, we'll talk about this, telling our stories, what's the uniqueness and what's been the impact on the parents as well as the children. And again, I know that Kat, I think you did a whole thing on telling our stories. And, yesterday's panel, I wish you could have videotaped it. So powerful. And that could be duplicated easily in every one of your programs. And I think we need to think creatively. Like, we cannot, how do you become the most beloved program in your community? It's got to be with outreach. It's got to be with partners. It's got to be with telling your story kind of on a regular basis. And it's not just the story of a parent's success. It's the economic impact in your community that you have. And it's the children's success. Data and money are two big influences in our society today. But it doesn't come full circle unless you get the parent story. That is just so critical. And so today, and it's interesting, there's this term, return on investment, ROI. And there is a pretty famous guy, a research scientist, Dr. James Heckman. And he has really compelling research, and he is pretty well respected, that he has proven that the highest rate of economic return are from the earliest investments you make in young children. And in fact, he quotes, for every dollar that we spend in Head Start, we get $7 back. Now, I would even urge you to go take a look at some of his research. It's really interesting. But then how do you take that? Because if you live, I don't know, Warwick, Rhode Island, is a community, did I say it right? Okay. Okay. I at least got it right? Okay. How much is it going to matter to people in the local community if you're talking about a renowned researcher that says 7-to-1 return? But it should be your stepping point to say, okay, I know that's fact. How does that translate into talking about my community? So we have to get smart and take what is there and recognized as reliable and figure out how can we tell that story within our community. And I think I said the other day, I think it's relevant everywhere, but I look at, you've got a lot of rural programs here. And I gotta believe you are the anchor. And sometimes you're the only game in town. And what if Head Start went away in those rural communities? And I think telling that story is really important. And again, expanding the partnerships, even people you don't like. And we cannot do this advocacy alone. We need friends, we need partners, we need colleagues, we need local businesses, we need elected officials in our state, we need school committee people in our local community. And I realize as I say this, it feels like such added work. But I think it's been kind of a missing element all along that we didn't talk enough about our programs. And I think this time, and Kat gave us, that ray of hope, we've always been effective. So I just say we have to think, what partners in your community had you never thought about inviting? Having town hall is not a really nice term to use these days because I know they've been very tough, but having like a community night where you invite people that you've never invited to learn about Head Start. And maybe have some parents telling their stories. I think it takes it does take time and it does take creativity. And I know you're worrying about so many other things, but I kind of think we're in the fight for our life. And I think it's important to pull out all the tools in the toolbox that are going to help us along the way. The other thing I think, and I always say this, taking care of business. Here you are preparing for what might be a, level 5 hurricane, and you have a program to run. And keeping your eyes on the program and making sure that you're paying attention to daily operations, both fiscal, and programmatic. Thank you. And I think even at this time you're saying, I can't even begin to think about what changes I need to make in my program. I think we need to continue to ask ourselves, do I have the right program design? Are my options, are the options that I offer make me competitive in my community? And am I really meeting the needs based on my community assessment? Does my options reflect what those needs are? And I always want to put a plug in, because when we take a look at the data, and we know there's been an explosion in preschool programs across the country, who's taking care of the babies, the infants, the moms, the pregnant ones. And so I think about you, I urge you to find the space to continue to talk about, do we have the right fit, the right design for our community? And the other thing is, I know that I have said previously, give the regional office some grace
and I mean that. But that doesn't mean you stop asking for something you need. And I say this, it is so important, because even if they turn you down or don't respond, you have a track record when the time comes to say, I identified this need 2 years ago, a year ago. I think that you can't stop because our federal colleagues have kind of had to halt how they normally do business. You want to keep present, and they can be lovely emails. We know you're very busy, but you have to keep documenting what the needs are. And I would also say, don't ask the feds for something that is within your purview to decide. You know, there was a program that reached out to me, really good program. They submitted a request to the feds for budget revision that was for $3,375. And because they submitted it, even though the federal person, was Region 1, said, I'm not really sure you need to do this. Man, you submit that official document, you are asking for permission. And I'm saying, always, never ask. And I think even when I was in local programs and even when I was a federal official, I would see this dependency that programs had. They wanted to be, you folks were so compliance driven, right? We want to do it right, we don't want to make a mistake. And so you often call the feds for stuff that could really be dealt with at the local level. And I think one of the best examples of ensuring that you have taken your autonomy, and I'm going to say it, is what's happened to the RAND situation? What's happened to getting deficiencies for a health and safety incident? There was a bad OIG report, Office of Inspector General, a couple of years ago, and it said Head Start centers weren't safe. And of course, it was distorted data. We know that situations happen, that it's nobody's fault, and it's not systemic. But many of you have paid an incredible price for that. And whether or not the new rule, remember the final rule that came out, whether or not that is sustained, and it looks like it might be, even if that were not, even if it was struck down, you had the authority and the autonomy to make a decision about if there was a health and safety incident. You had the autonomy to make a determination whether or not it was significant. And many of us chose not to do that. I was at a conference in DC last year, and a really seasoned, bright director came up and said, I just want to run something by you. You know, we had an incident, and the child, 10, 15 minutes out of our sight, the cameras were on. The child was in the corridor. And I wanted to say, are you crazy? And I want to say to people, have the confidence to say, you know, do you need a process and a system internally within your program? Absolutely. But you have the right and the responsibility to make that decision. And I'm not trying to undermine. I'm saying we fed into the craziness. When the OIG sent out the report, feds overreact and programs overreact as well. And frankly, I think every regional office in the world would be really happy if you all didn't keep asking them, significant or not, because you're the ones that have the facts, the content to make that decision. So another one that I want to speak to is suspension. This is really a hard subject, and I even hate the word suspension. I don't think suspension, in my view, we do not make a decision to suspend a child. We make a decision that we must suspend the services because they're not meeting the child's needs. I have heard again, and this has been pervasive throughout the country, where directors will say, this year has been a disaster in this center because we had one child that we could not manage. And we were afraid for that child. Other children's parents started pulling their kids out because their kids were getting hurt. And what I want to say is, there's people, I think, have made us feel guilty. That if we ever came to the point where we did everything and we could not reasonably accommodate that child for his own health and well-being, or for her own safety, or the safety of other children, then it is reasonable to say that we need to suspend services and figure out something alternative. Because when they say, find an immediate place, come on, folks. How many of you have a child that may need more than you can give? And again, I'm not saying you don't pull out all the stops, because we want to be that place that can accommodate. But there are some children that we are putting them at risk, and other children, if we don't have those hard discussions. And again, do you need a process? Do you need it documented? And I'm saying this because we are suffering in ways and beating ourselves up and not feeling like we have tools that we actually have. Now, you're talking to a person with special needs. You know, that was my beginning. So I'm as passionate as anyone about mainstreaming children into a typically developing environment. But if you have a classroom that has 53% of the children needing significant services, are you a mainstream setting anymore? Or are you a therapeutic setting? And if you're a therapeutic setting, what does that mean? So again, you're saying, the house is on fire, and she's talking about program. But these are the things that we need to attend to continue to keep us strong as we move through these challenges. We got the autonomy to keep our program strong. And then the autonomy we don't have is to make sure we're safe and head start. We can contribute to that, but we have to convince others. But we have so much power within our programs to do what is necessary to ensure we're keeping every child safe. So, I guess I feel a little bit strongly about reporting and suspensions. I apologize. It's funny, years ago, what my soapbox was? Non-federal share. What do you mean you can't get a waiver? That's crazy. If you don't have the non-federal share, you don't have it. So we have moved on from that, so there is some progress there, right? So, planning for the future. And I use the word unthinkable because I do think we have to think about the unthinkable things that could happen, the what ifs. And I know we have some colleagues that say, don't talk about block granting because you might give them an idea. Well, we're sort of not giving these folks any ideas, let me tell you. And we're not advertising. But we suspect, no matter what, Head Start's probably going to change in some way. And so I would want us to think, if the extreme happened, well, I suppose the extreme would be we don't get funded, but I'm not going there. If they decided, because we do have an administration that loves to turn everything over to the states, I mean, that was, kind of apparent yesterday, or was it yesterday in the signing? Dismantling the Department of Education. But I think we need to have serious conversations. And it's almost like you need a dual path, parallel paths, taking care of business, doing what I need to do to be the most beloved and successful program in my community. And at the same time, I think you need to be having quiet conversations in your program and in particularly within your state associations. If it went to block granting, what kind of political climate are we in my state? Some states, could probably work it out. But you need to have conversations that have a plan. Just plan A is not going to work. You got to have a plan B and maybe a plan C. And maybe that plan B is one of the, maybe plan C, if we hear rumblings of block granting. What in our state do we hold most sacred about our Head Start program that we then would shift, if the time came, and be prepared with our arguments and our positions to your state government? Is that how many states have an early childhood structure? How many have an early childhood council? Who's going to be making the decisions? And my gut is, even if those begin to bubble, those conversations, I'm talking about upstairs, nationally, they can't do block granting without us. They don't have the infrastructure. So, and does it mean that there'd be a lessening of standards? We don't know, because as Kat said the other day, block granting, they have some flexibilities to kind of use the money the way they want. And the state of Rhode Island or Vermont or Virginia, what are the things that you would go to that table with and say, these are non-negotiables. These are the things we value most. Now I know you've got 1,300 standards. I suppose you can have a conversation amongst yourself and say, well, we could do without these and we'll keep these. It's really thinking about how do you preserve what the intent and purpose of Head Start is. So you have to have these conversations. And I don't know, and I know we have a few collab directors here. I'm not sure what role the collabs can or will play, and it probably depends on the environment they're in within their state. We know that some collab people are sort of buried in a basement, and others have a more prominent role. Your state association, you got to mobilize as a state and think also, you think federal, you think local, now we're asking you to think state strategies. And I'm not saying this is easy, but what we don't want is for the time to come when someone says, we're gonna consider this, and we don't have our arguments and our strategies ready. So again, I think that is, I would urge you, and I don't think it's a wasted exercise. I think it's important to be prepared. And we hope you never have to exercise those, but I don't think it is, I don't think it's an unimportant thing to do. And I think we have to pick, I think the other thing, and this goes along with what we're saying, your plans, we have to pick the right fights. And it was interesting when, and I say this with the greatest of sympathy and hurt, when I heard that, we had 35 feds in the Office of Head Start, I think it was 35, 31, whatever, and a lot more grants people fired. Man, people were upset, and they wanted to go and fight for their federal staff. And I say, as humbly as I can, federal staff is not your fight. Unless you can say, because of the lack of support, this is impacting our children and families. Every argument you make, every fight you take on has got to be because of the negative impact changes will have on children and families. So pick your fights. And I know that we are all, and I say this humbly, we're all bleeding hearts, right? We have so many passions for our neighbors and our friends who need support. But in this time, you might not be able to take on a primary role fighting for something else. You can support another organization, but keep your eyes on your prize. And I think the one thing that I would say, now don't go telling Marina I said don't fight for federal staff. No, she gets it. She absolutely understands it. It's so interesting. I think about, as I said to you in the beginning, and I don't know why I'm inserting this, but it just seems applicable to today. I had a teacher training somewhere in the 80s, and we had a professor from Wheelock come. Her name was Dr. Joanne Brady. I don't know if anyone, and she was an former TNTA person, really brilliant, and her field was disabilities. And I attended all the teacher trainings, and she said to my teaching staff, the most important thing you can instill in your preschoolers, because we didn't have early head start at that time, she said, is to help them understand life isn't always fair and they don't get a turn every day. That has stuck with me for 40 years, and I feel like we're those people. Life is not fair. But when it's our turn, we better be ready to take it instead of pouting in the corner because we didn't get our turn. So I just want to say that, and I would end by saying, you have to find joy. There is a lot of cruelty, there's a lot of sadness. I have a neighbor who's literally making herself physically sick over this. And her husband said, this is a long journey. You have to find a distraction. So, what was my distraction? I volunteered at a dog and cat rescue. And for 2.5 hours, I just stroked the little puppies, and they love me out, and it gives me a moment of joy. And I just think we have to identify. It could be family members, it could be gardening, it could be, you have to have some joy. This is too difficult a journey without it. And I think as my first big boss in federal government, Helen Taylor, said, and when you have those discussions about anything that relates to children and families, and now that discussion that may occur about block granting, or Head Start looking different in some ways, she said, put an infant in the middle of the table and keep your eyes on the infant. You will never forget what's important, because keeping our priorities clear during these times is really important. And we could get distracted very easily if we don't keep the focus on the children and families. And another thing that a man said to me, a very famous guy that was came out of West Ed, Ron Lally, Dr. Ron Lally. He's now since passed, but he did the best infant toddler training when we first had early Head Start. I'm not plagiarizing him exactly because he said something different, but I have adapted it. He said in a speech, and it was so powerful to me, bathe your children, and he was talking about infants and toddlers, bathe your children every day in language. And that whole sort of, thought of just covering up the babies in language. And so I kind of changed it and adapted it to these days. But our kids need to be bathed in love every day. They really do. And sometimes with all the stresses, we may forget how important that is, that child feels loved every day. And sometimes for our teaching staff who have such hard jobs, helping them understand, where to pack the stresses so it's not obvious to the children, because they pick up. Someone was eloquent the other day and talked about, how the stress of the director is feeding into the stress the teachers have. And kids pick up on stuff so easily, even infants, and we know that from research. So I would say, bathe those kids in love every day, and thank you, Ron Lally. And we had also a discussion about DEI last night, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I said to the folks that we were talking to, we exude DEI. Even without, if we can't use the words anymore, our behavior demonstrates who we are. We're inclusive, we believe in equity, and we believe in inclusion. And what matters most is not what flag you're flying outside, except maybe the Head Start flag. It's how you treat that family when they open the door of that first knock, or when they walk into that center for the first time. Do they feel included? Are they accepted for who they are? That's what we do. So even if you feel robbed that we've got a government that's saying, can't use those words, that doesn't mean that you don't walk the talk every day. Nobody can take away our behavior and our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, even if we can't say it or write it. So again, part of my theme is figuring the power that you have. We're not diminishing our principles and our morals, because the relationships that we create with our staff, with our parents, with our caregivers, and with our kids, that's what matters. And that's what's going to keep us alive. So, with that, I want to thank you. I know most of you probably have a short ride home.